Dear colleagues, Ministry of Defense spokesperson Mr. Vilyen Pidgornyy will speak on Russia's military aggression in eastern Ukraine. Mr. Pidgornyy, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me give you a weekly update on Russian aggression against Ukraine between February 27th and March 5th. Last week was marked by significant escalation in the anti-terrorist operation area. The enemy expanded the geography of its combat activity and increased the intensity of fire. The militants continued violating the agreement to withdraw heavy weapons from the front line and carried out armored provocations with the aim of shifting the blame onto Ukrainian armed forces. Between February 27th and March 5th, the average daily number of enemy ceasefire violations increased and ranged from 84 on Monday, February 27th, to a whopping 153 on Thursday, March 2nd. The total number of enemy shellings of Ukrainian positions amounted to 760 over the last week. In 42% of cases, the enemy used heavy weapons. Now to the overall situation at the front line over the past week. Luhansk sector. Starting from Tuesday, February 28th, the enemy began using mortars, tanks, armored vehicles, as well as 122 and 152 millimeter artillery. Let me remind you that the latter is prohibited by the Minsk agreements. Most of the attacks by the militants took place during the daytime and occasionally at night. The daily number of shells and bombs fired against the positions of Ukrainian armed forces amounted to several hundred per day. On February 28th, the enemy conducted an intense shelling of Krymsk with 152 millimeter artillery, having fired 40 shells. In the evening, the militants several times used artillery against Troitsk, and on March 2nd, Krymsk, Katerynivka, and Novozvanivka came under enemy mortar fire. During one of the attacks against Krymsk, militants fired 60 mortar bombs in just 45 minutes. In the evening, the enemy shelled the area near Lysychansk. We're talking about 18 shells from 152 millimeter artillery. Those rare positions are located more than 15 kilometers from the front line. This is the first time in 2 years that the enemy shelled this area. March 3rd was the most intense day in the Luhansk sector over the last week. In the afternoon, the militants launched severe mortar attack against Krymsk and Novo-Oleksandrivka. More than 100 mortar bombs were fired at Ukrainian armed forces positions over the 2 hours. That day, the enemy forces fired about 300 bombs and artillery shells at positions of Ukrainian armed forces in the whole sector. Daily combat activity of the enemy in the sector ranged between 6 ceasefire violations on February 27th and 39 on March 4th. Donetsk sector. Intense enemy attacks took place across the whole front line of the sector. The average number of bombs and shells fired at positions of Ukrainian troops amounted to about 300. Avdiivka remains the hottest spot in the area. The enemy shelled the positions of Ukrainian armed forces from 3 directions and actively used tanks both near Avdiivka industrial area and the positions east and south of the city. On February 27th, due to heavy tank shelling, the buildings of Shakhta Butovka position collapsed. Svetlodarsk area, Gorlivka perimeter, and Donetsk airport area came under intense enemy shelling as well. Also, the militants used tanks in Verkhnytoretsk and Novhorodsk. This week, The mortar attacks started early in the morning and continued intermittently until late in the evening. The enemy launched an average of 30 mortar bombs per shelling in case of Avdiivka and 15 in other spots. March 1st and 2nd were the most intense days in terms of combat activity in the sector. On Wednesday, nearly 500 bombs and shells were fired against the positions of Ukrainian armed forces. On Thursday, the enemy forces attacked Avdiivka with tanks and mortars from 2 to 10 p.m., having released more than 200 shells and bombs. Daily combat activity of the militants in the sector ranged between 29 ceasefire violations on March 4th and 46 on February 28th, March 1st and 2nd. Now, as far as Mariupol is concerned, more than 80% of the ceasefire violations in the sector took place in Shirokine and Pavlopil, part of the front line. The enemy repeatedly opened gunfire at night, followed by full-scale mortar attacks starting from 7 o'clock in the morning. The militants occasionally used tanks. In the morning of February 28th, the militants conducted heavy artillery shelling of Vodyane, having fired about 70 artillery shells and bombs in just 30 minutes. The next day, the enemy attacked Shirokine, Vodyane, and Hnutove with artillery. In the evening of March 1st, Krasnohorivka came under heavy attack by enemy mortars, artillery, and tanks. On March 2nd, the militants fired 20 Grad rockets at Ukrainian positions in Vodyane, and shortly after this, the enemy fired nearly 100 shells and bombs against Shirokine. On March 4th, the militants fired 50 shells against Novotroitske at night and another 50 shells against Vodyane in the morning. Mariinka and Novomikhailivka, as well as Novogrigorivka, also came under enemy artillery fire. The average number of registered ceasefire violations conducted by the enemy was about 50 per day. Over the week, Ukrainian troops observed the increased activity of enemy drones, which may be associated with improved weather conditions. Last week, Ukrainian troops registered 14 episodes of enemy UAVs conducting aerial reconnaissance in the anti-terrorist operation area. Based on the data from Ukrainian intelligence, Russia did not provide munition or weapons and military equipment to their proxies in eastern Ukraine in the last 7 days. Nevertheless, it continued supplying militants with petroleum and oil products, having delivered 43 fuel tanks via the railroad. Ukrainian military intelligence reports that the number of casualties amongst Russian proxies is 7 killed and 31 wounded over the week. We can also confirm that the enemy lost 2 UAVs and 1 armored combat vehicle during hostilities last week. Last week, 5 Ukrainian servicemen were killed in action, and 55 servicemen, including 1 State Border Guard Service of Ukraine officer, were wounded in action. Our hearts go out to the families and friends of the fallen Ukrainian heroes. 4 civilians, namely 3 women in the Donetsk region and 1 man in Popasna district of Luhansk region, were injured as a result of the enemy shellings of residential districts close to the front line. Over 70 buildings and infrastructure facilities were damaged due to hostile shelling in Popasna district, Zaitsevo, Avdiivka, and Hnutove. This includes 51 private houses and apartments in Avdiivka, 10 private houses in Mariinka district, and 1 private house in Hnutove. The following municipal facilities incurred damage by direct hits of enemy shells: water pump station, metal factory in Popasna, school building in Avdiivka, kindergarten in Mariinka, and a railway track in Krasnohorivka. That will be all for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pidgornyy. Looking forward to seeing you here next Monday.